Sometimes the biggest mystery is not why a disaster happened, but why so many chances to survive quietly disappeared before anyone realized they were gone. Just after midnight, one of Titanic's lifeboats began its slow descent toward the calm Atlantic, carrying far fewer people than it was designed to hold. As it drifted away from the brightly illuminated ship, empty seats remained visible inside while hundreds of passengers still stood on the decks above. More than a century later, those empty places continue to raise one of the most difficult questions in maritime history. Why did more people not survive? The answer seems obvious at first. Most people have heard that Titanic did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. That statement is true, but it is only part of the story. It does not explain why some of the earliest lifeboats left before reaching their full capacity. It does not explain why many passengers initially hesitated to climb inside. It does not explain why some people reached the boat deck while others struggled to find a path there. Most importantly, it does not explain why thousands of intelligent, experienced, and capable people found themselves making decisions that seem almost impossible to understand from the safety of modern hindsight. Looking backward through history is deceptively easy because we already know how the night ended. The people standing on Titanic's decks did not. They could not see the flooding hidden below the waterline. They could not measure the rate at which seawater was spreading through the ship's forward compartments. They could not calculate how quickly the vessel's remaining buoyancy was disappearing. What they could see was a ship that still stood upright beneath clear skies, with electric lights glowing warmly through every window and a calm ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. To many passengers, stepping into a small wooden lifeboat suspended above freezing water may have appeared far more dangerous than remaining aboard what still looked like one of the safest ships ever built. That difference between what people knew and what they believed they were seeing would shape countless decisions. During the next 2 hours. This documentary is not an attempt to assign blame to a single person or reduce one of history's most studied disasters to a simple explanation. Instead, it follows the evidence left behind in survivor testimony, official inquiries, engineering analysis, passenger records, wireless logs, and modern historical research to reconstruct how opportunities for survival gradually narrowed. Some disappeared because of design limitations established long before the voyage began. Others vanished through hesitation, misunderstanding, physical distance, or the relentless passage of time. Every stage of the evacuation removed another possible path to safety until only a handful remained. The tragedy was not created by one moment alone. It emerged through a sequence of decisions, assumptions, and circumstances that quietly reinforced one another while most of the people aboard still believed there was time. Those empty seats drifting away from the ship were never the whole story. They were simply the first visible clue that something far more complicated had already begun, and before we can understand why so many lives were lost, we first have to understand what the people aboard actually knew during those first crucial minutes after everything changed. The first obstacle to survival was not freezing water, a shortage of lifeboats, or even the distance to the nearest rescue ship. It was uncertainty. In the minutes immediately following the collision at 11:40 that evening, very few people aboard had any reason to believe they were facing a disaster. The impact itself had been surprisingly gentle for most passengers. Some noticed a slight vibration beneath their feet. Others felt a subtle shudder pass through the enormous ship before everything became quiet again. Conversations resumed in dining rooms and lounges. Music continued. Stewards reassured curious guests that there was little cause for concern. From almost anywhere above the waterline, the ship looked exactly as it had only moments earlier. The decks remained level. The lights burned brightly. The engines had stopped, but silence alone did not suggest catastrophe. Deep below those polished decks, however, the situation looked entirely different. As seawater entered the forward compartments, Chief Designer Thomas Andrews began inspecting the damage alongside Captain Edward Smith and senior officers. Andrews understood the ship's internal structure better than almost anyone alive. He did not need dramatic scenes or rising panic to recognize the danger. The watertight compartments that had made Titanic famous were never intended to survive damage spreading across so many sections at once. Water was already moving where it should never have been, and every minute allowed it to advance farther through the vessel. The cruel reality was that the evidence proving the ship was doomed existed almost entirely out of sight. Passengers could not observe flooded mail rooms or damaged boiler rooms. They could not measure the flow of seawater beneath the decks or calculate how long the remaining buoyancy would last. They saw elegant staircases, warm lighting, and crew members who were still carrying out their duties with remarkable composure. From their perspective, abandoning the largest passenger ship ever built for a small wooden lifeboat hanging above a dark ocean required a leap of faith that many understandably struggled to make. This gap between professional knowledge and public perception shaped nearly every decision that followed. Crew members were asked to prepare lifeboats before most passengers believed they were necessary. Families had to decide whether to separate while the ship still appeared stable beneath their feet. Some people accepted instructions immediately, while others chose to remain where they felt safest. Neither response seems irrational when viewed through the information available at that exact moment rather than through the certainty history gives us today. Human beings naturally rely on what they can see, hear, and experience directly, especially during unexpected situations. On Titanic, those instincts often pointed towards staying aboard rather than leaving. The evacuation therefore began with an invisible disadvantage. Before there was confusion on crowded decks or difficult choices at lifeboats, there was a simple but powerful misunderstanding. The people responsible for the ship already knew time was disappearing, while most of the people whose lives depended on that knowledge could not yet see any convincing evidence that time was running out at all. That disconnect would soon collide with another problem, because even after the order to load the lifeboats was given, there was no single, perfectly unified system guiding how that evacuation would unfold across the ship. Once the order was given to prepare the lifeboats, another reality emerged, one that is often overlooked because it unfolded quietly rather than dramatically. There was no single evacuation unfolding across Titanic. There were several, happening at the same time, directed by different officers who shared the same objective but sometimes interpreted their instructions differently. The phrase that has become forever associated with the disaster, "women and children first," sounded simple enough. In practice, it depended entirely on the judgment of the officer standing beside each lifeboat, the number of passengers waiting nearby, the amount of time he believed remained, and how he understood his responsibility. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller generally applied the rule in its strictest form. If women or children were nearby, they were called forward first. Even when seats remained available, adult men were often expected to step back unless circumstances clearly demanded otherwise. Across the ship on the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch appeared to apply the same principle with greater flexibility. Women and children still received priority, but if no others were immediately available and empty seats remained, some male passengers were allowed aboard rather than sending the lifeboat away partially filled. Neither officer believed he was acting irresponsibly. Both were trying to save as many lives as possible while managing an emergency that no one aboard had ever rehearsed on this scale. The crew faced enormous challenges of their own. Although many sailors had practiced lowering lifeboats during training, they had never attempted to launch every boat from a fully occupied passenger liner in the middle of the North Atlantic during a freezing spring night. They had to organize crowds, prepare equipment, unlock covers, swing heavy davits outward, load passengers carefully, and lower each lifeboat more than 60 feet to the ocean below without damaging it or endangering the people inside. Every launch required coordination, judgment, and precious minutes that could never be recovered. At the same time, passengers were arriving at different speeds from different parts of the ship. Some cabins were only a short walk from the boat deck. Others required long routes through unfamiliar passageways and staircases. Families became separated while searching for one another. Some paused to gather valuables or warmer clothing because the danger still seemed uncertain. Others hesitated because the ship beneath them remained brightly lit and remarkably steady. Crew members often found themselves urging reluctant passengers into lifeboats instead of calming panicked crowds. That detail alone reveals how different the early evacuation was from the image many people imagine today. The greatest challenge during those first launches was not widespread panic but widespread disbelief. As a result, each section of the boat deck developed its own rhythm. Some lifeboats waited for additional passengers. Others departed because officers feared delaying any longer would risk everyone already aboard. Decisions that appeared reasonable within a single moment later seemed difficult to understand once the full outcome became known. Yet those decisions were made without knowing exactly how much time remained. The officers could not see the future any more than the passengers could. They acted with incomplete information, relying on experience, instinct, and responsibility while the ship continued its slow, almost imperceptible transformation beneath their feet. Even so, one question remained unanswered. Different officers could organize the evacuation in different ways, but none of those choices mattered unless passengers could actually reach the boat deck before another invisible barrier quietly reduced their chances of survival. While the officers worked to organize the lifeboats, another factor quietly shaped who would arrive in time to board them. It was not a matter of courage or determination. It was geography. Titanic was often described as a floating city, and like any city, where a person began their journey could dramatically influence where they ended up. The ship stretched more than 880 feet from bow to stern and contained a maze of grand staircases, narrow passageways, service corridors, crew spaces, dining rooms, cabins, and enclosed sections spread across multiple decks. During ordinary travel, this complex design offered comfort, privacy, and efficiency. During an evacuation, it became a race against distance. Imagine 3 passengers receiving the same instruction at nearly the same moment. One is staying in a first-class cabin only a short distance below the boat deck. A few staircases later, that passenger is already standing beneath the cold night sky, able to see crew members preparing the lifeboats and hear officers calling for women and children. Another passenger begins farther below in the second-class accommodations. The route upward is longer but still reasonably direct, requiring several flights of stairs before reaching the open deck. A third passenger starts deep within the third-class areas, where cabins occupied the lower sections of the ship. The journey upward is considerably more complicated, involving unfamiliar corridors, changes in direction, stairways that connect different sections, and the challenge of finding the correct route while surrounded by hundreds of other people trying to understand what was happening. Historical investigations have shown that many popular stories oversimplify this part of the disaster. There is no reliable evidence that all third-class passengers were deliberately locked below while the evacuation unfolded. The reality was more complicated and, in many ways, more troubling. The ship had internal barriers designed to comply with immigration regulations and to separate passenger classes during normal operations. Crew members were responsible for directing people through designated routes toward the boat deck, but those routes were unfamiliar to many passengers, and communication was not always clear. Language differences, uncertainty, and the sheer complexity of the ship itself all consumed valuable time. Every additional hallway, every wrong turn, and every delayed instruction quietly reduced the number of opportunities that remained. Even passengers who eventually reached the upper decks often arrived to find that the situation had already changed. Lifeboats that had been waiting minutes earlier were now descending toward the ocean. Officers who had been searching for volunteers were now urging those nearby to board immediately. The gradual list of the ship, barely noticeable at first, slowly altered the pace of every operation. None of these obstacles guaranteed a particular outcome on their own, but together they created unequal paths toward the same destination. Survival was influenced not only by personal decisions but also by physical location, available information, and the amount of time required simply to stand where a lifeboat could be reached. This is one reason historians continue to study passenger records, deck plans, and survivor testimony with such care. They reveal that opportunity was never distributed evenly across the ship. Yet even geography cannot fully explain who ultimately lived and who did not. 2 passengers standing only a few feet apart could still face entirely different futures, because another powerful force was beginning to shape every decision on the boat deck. It was not where people stood that mattered most now. It was who was being invited to take the next available seat. By the time more passengers reached the boat deck, another pattern had begun to emerge, one that would later become unmistakable when historians compared passenger lists with survivor records. The opportunity to enter a lifeboat was influenced by more than location alone. It was also shaped by social expectations, official instructions, family responsibilities, and the difficult choices that unfolded within only a few rapidly disappearing minutes. The phrase "women and children first" has become one of the defining images of that night, but understanding its true impact requires looking beyond the words themselves. During the early 20th century, the expectation that men should step aside so that women and children could be evacuated first was deeply rooted in maritime tradition. Many passengers accepted that principle without argument because it reflected the values of the era. Fathers helped their wives and children into lifeboats while remaining behind. Crew members repeatedly called for women to come forward even as many hesitated, unwilling to leave husbands, brothers, or parents standing on the deck. Some families delayed boarding because separating felt more frightening than remaining together aboard a ship that still appeared remarkably stable. Others believed there would be another lifeboat only moments later, unaware that each departure quietly reduced the number of opportunities remaining. The numbers recorded after the disaster reveal how these decisions influenced survival. Women and children, particularly those traveling in first class, survived at significantly higher rates than adult men. Yet those statistics alone cannot explain individual experiences. Some women declined to board because they refused to leave loved ones behind. Some men survived because no women or children were immediately present when a particular lifeboat was ready to depart, while others remained on deck after helping family members into safety, believing there would still be enough time for themselves. Members of the crew faced an entirely different dilemma. Many were instructed to continue operating equipment, assisting passengers, preparing additional lifeboats, maintaining order, or performing other essential duties. Every minute spent helping others was a minute not spent searching for a place in a lifeboat themselves. Their responsibilities often required them to remain where they were needed until the final stages of the evacuation. Looking back with complete knowledge of the outcome, it is tempting to evaluate every decision as either correct or mistaken. The evidence suggests a more complicated reality. Nearly every choice was made under conditions of incomplete information. A husband encouraging his family to board believed he might follow shortly afterward. A woman refusing to leave without her husband could not know how quickly circumstances would change. An officer ordering another lifeboat lowered had no reliable way to measure exactly how much time remained before launching additional boats would become increasingly difficult. The difference between surviving and not surviving was often measured not by bravery or intelligence but by timing measured in only a few minutes. Historians continue to emphasize this point because it changes how the disaster is understood. The people aboard were not simply divided into those who made wise decisions and those who did not. They were responding to limited information, powerful social expectations, and rapidly changing conditions that no passenger had ever experienced before. Even if every person had acted immediately and every available seat had been filled from the beginning, one unavoidable fact still remained. There were simply not enough places for everyone aboard, and that harsh mathematical reality had been established long before Titanic ever left the dock, hidden not in the decisions made that night but within the safety regulations that governed the ship before its voyage even began. The shortage of lifeboats has often been presented as the single reason so many lives were lost, but the historical record tells a more nuanced story. The number of lifeboats aboard was unquestionably inadequate for every passenger and crew member, yet that limitation did not begin with one captain, one shipbuilder, or one voyage. It began years earlier in the regulations that governed the rapidly changing world of ocean travel. During the early 20th century, passenger ships were growing larger at an extraordinary pace, but safety requirements had not evolved at the same speed. British maritime regulations determined the minimum number of lifeboats primarily by a vessel's registered tonnage rather than by the total number of people it could carry. Once a ship exceeded a certain size, the required number of lifeboats no longer increased in proportion to its growing capacity. Titanic, despite being one of the largest passenger liners ever constructed, carried enough lifeboats to satisfy and even exceed the legal requirements of its day. That fact often surprises modern audiences because today's expectations are very different. Looking back through the lens of modern safety standards, it seems unimaginable that a passenger ship could legally sail without enough places for everyone aboard. In 1912, however, many naval architects, shipping companies, and government officials believed the combination of watertight compartments, advanced engineering, and the reliability of nearby shipping lanes made a complete evacuation unlikely. Lifeboats were often viewed as temporary ferries that would transfer passengers from a damaged vessel to a rescue ship rather than as the sole means of survival for every person on board. That assumption influenced regulations, ship design, and public confidence alike. There were also practical arguments that reflected the thinking of the period. Some engineers believed covering the boat deck with additional lifeboats could interfere with passenger movement and complicate launching procedures during an emergency. Others argued that overcrowding the deck with equipment might create new hazards instead of reducing existing ones. Whether those concerns were ultimately justified remains a subject of historical discussion, but they demonstrate that the decisions were shaped by the knowledge and assumptions available before the disaster, not by the lessons learned afterward. Even if Titanic had carried more lifeboats, they would still have required trained crews, organized loading, and enough time to launch them safely. The evidence suggests that increasing the number of boats alone would not have guaranteed a perfect evacuation, yet it would almost certainly have expanded the number of available seats. That distinction is important because it separates what the evidence can support from what remains speculative. Historians can confidently state that the available capacity was insufficient for everyone aboard. They cannot state with certainty exactly how many additional lives would have been saved under a different configuration because that outcome would still depend on weather, timing, organization, and countless human decisions made under extraordinary pressure. In many ways, the mathematics of survival had been quietly established before the ship ever departed Southampton. Once the voyage began, every decision made on board unfolded within limits created by regulations that reflected another era's confidence in technology. Yet even those fixed limits do not explain everything. As the evacuation continued, another resource began disappearing even faster than the remaining seats in the lifeboats. It was the one resource that no regulation, no engineer, and no officer could ever replace once it was gone. It was time itself. As the minutes passed, the most valuable resource aboard the ship was no longer measured in lifeboats or distance. It was measured in time. Every successful evacuation depends on a window during which people can be organized, equipment can be prepared, and safe decisions can still be made. On that April night, the window was already beginning to close long before most passengers realized it had even opened. After Chief Designer Thomas Andrews completed his inspection, he understood that the damage was beyond recovery. The flooding would continue, and the ship would eventually sink. What no one could determine with complete certainty was exactly how much time remained. Estimates had to be made from experience rather than observation because the true extent of the flooding was hidden beneath the decks. Officers therefore faced an impossible balance. If they moved too aggressively, they risked convincing passengers to abandon a vessel that still appeared secure. If they waited too long, the opportunity to launch lifeboats in an orderly manner would gradually disappear. Every lifeboat required careful preparation before it could leave the ship. Covers had to be removed, supplies checked, passengers assisted aboard, ropes handled correctly, and the heavy boats lowered more than 60 feet to the surface of the Atlantic. None of those steps could be rushed without introducing new dangers. At the same time, each launch occupied crew members who could not immediately prepare the next boat. The evacuation therefore unfolded as a sequence rather than a single coordinated movement. While one lifeboat descended toward the water, another was still being loaded, another was being uncovered, and additional passengers were only beginning to arrive on the boat deck. During the earliest launches, officers often found themselves waiting for more women and children to come forward because relatively few believed immediate departure was necessary. Those delays appeared reasonable while the decks remained nearly level and the ship retained its familiar appearance. Yet every minute spent searching for additional passengers quietly reduced the amount of time available for every lifeboat that had not yet been launched. As the night continued, the character of the evacuation slowly changed. The ship's forward section settled lower into the ocean, making the change visible even to those with no engineering knowledge. What had once seemed like caution gradually became urgency. More passengers hurried toward the boat deck. Crew members worked continuously to prepare the remaining boats. Decisions that earlier could be made carefully now had to be made much more quickly because the conditions themselves were changing beneath everyone's feet. By the final stages of the evacuation, launching additional lifeboats had become significantly more difficult. The increasing angle of the deck affected both movement and equipment. Time that had seemed abundant shortly after the collision had become the rarest commodity aboard. Looking backward, it is easy to imagine that every empty seat represented a permanent lost opportunity. The historical evidence suggests something more complex. Some opportunities disappeared because passengers hesitated. Others vanished because officers believed they still had enough time to send another boat later. Still others were lost because every successful launch required minutes that could never be recovered once they had passed. Time did not disappear all at once. It narrowed steadily, almost unnoticed, until the remaining choices became painfully limited. Yet even as those final opportunities vanished, one last hope still existed beyond the horizon. Wireless operators continued sending distress calls into the night. Another ship was racing toward the reported position with all possible speed, and a nearby vessel would later become the center of one of the most enduring questions in the history of the disaster. While the final lifeboats were leaving the ship, another race was unfolding far beyond the people gathered on the boat deck. Inside the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued transmitting distress messages across the Atlantic, reaching as many ships as possible before the equipment could no longer operate. Their signals carried the ship's position, its growing emergency, and an increasingly urgent request for immediate assistance. Those messages were received by several vessels, but distance would determine whether any of them could arrive before the remaining opportunities for survival disappeared. Among the ships that answered most decisively was Carpathia, commanded by Captain Arthur Rostron. More than 50 miles away, Carpathia immediately changed course and increased speed as much as conditions safely allowed. Rostron ordered additional lookouts posted, prepared blankets, medical supplies, hot drinks, and every available space for survivors. It was an extraordinary response, but even under ideal conditions, the mathematics of distance could not be overcome. The ship simply had too many miles to cover before reaching the reported position. Closer to Titanic was another vessel whose name has remained part of the historical debate for more than a century, Californian. Its crew observed unusual lights in the distance and later reported seeing rockets fired into the night sky. Those observations became central to both the American and British investigations after the disaster because they raised a difficult question. If another ship appeared to be nearby, why did help not arrive sooner? The evidence does not support a simple answer. Historians continue to examine testimony from officers, wireless operators, navigational records, and later analyses, but several important facts remain clear. Californian had stopped for the night because of surrounding ice. Its wireless operator was no longer on duty when the most urgent distress messages were transmitted, and the officers who observed the distant vessel struggled to interpret exactly what they were seeing. The rockets were noticed, but their purpose was not immediately understood as an unmistakable signal of a large passenger liner in mortal danger. That distinction matters because history often invites us to replace uncertainty with certainty after the outcome is already known. The people making decisions that night did not possess the complete picture available to investigators afterward. They acted according to what they believed the available evidence meant at that moment. Meanwhile, aboard Titanic, every passing minute reduced the value of rescue that had not yet arrived. Even if another ship had appeared on the horizon, survivors still needed a way to leave the sinking liner and remain alive long enough to be recovered. The Atlantic that night measured only about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to turn every minute outside a lifeboat into a race against the environment itself. This is why the timing of the evacuation mattered so profoundly. Rescue was never simply about another ship reaching the scene. It depended on preserving enough opportunities for people to remain above the water until that help arrived. Carpathia would eventually reach the location and rescue those already aboard the lifeboats, but it could not travel backward through time to recover chances that had already been lost. Looking across the entire sequence of events, it becomes increasingly difficult to point toward one single failure as the explanation. Instead, the evidence reveals a chain of limitations, assumptions, distances, and decisions that reinforced one another until the outcome became almost impossible to reverse. The final question, then, is not who deserves all the blame. It is whether this tragedy was shaped by one fatal mistake or by many smaller failures that together left far fewer paths to survival than anyone aboard ever realized. Looking back across every stage of the investigation, one conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. No single decision, no single person, and no single mechanical failure can fully explain why so. Many people did not survive. The evidence points instead to a chain of events in which every weakness made the next weakness more difficult to overcome. The process began years before the voyage with safety regulations that did not require enough lifeboat capacity for everyone aboard. It continued with widespread confidence in the engineering of modern passenger liners, creating assumptions that influenced both design choices and emergency planning. When the collision occurred, the damage remained largely invisible to passengers, allowing uncertainty to replace urgency during the earliest and most valuable minutes of the evacuation. Different officers carried out the same mission with slightly different interpretations, while passengers approached the boat deck from very different locations throughout the enormous ship. Families faced impossible choices without understanding how little time remained. Crew members worked continuously to launch lifeboats under conditions they had never before experienced on such a scale. Some early boats departed with empty seats because those responsible believed there would still be time to fill later launches. As the ship slowly settled lower into the Atlantic, every remaining decision became more difficult than the one before it. The available lifeboats became fewer, the launch conditions became more challenging, and the opportunity to organize passengers steadily disappeared. At the same time, wireless operators succeeded in bringing help across the ocean, but distance imposed limits that determination alone could not overcome. Carpathia responded with remarkable speed, yet even the fastest possible response could not erase the miles that separated the rescue ship from the disaster. Californian remains one of the most discussed chapters in this history because it reminds us how easily incomplete information can shape human judgment. Even today, historians continue examining testimony and records, searching not for certainty where none exists but for a clearer understanding of how people interpreted the evidence available to them during those critical hours. This distinction matters because history is rarely served by replacing one oversimplified explanation with another. Some questions can be answered with confidence. We know the ship did not carry enough lifeboat spaces for everyone aboard. We know the evacuation began while many passengers still underestimated the danger. We know location, communication, timing, and social expectations all influenced access to the available boats. We know rescue arrived only after the evacuation had already reached its limits. Other questions remain less certain. Could every early lifeboat have been filled completely under the circumstances that existed at that moment? Could a faster recognition of the danger have saved additional lives? Could different procedures or updated regulations have changed the final number of survivors? The historical evidence strongly suggests that more people might have survived under different conditions, but it cannot honestly tell us exactly how many. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the historical record. It is part of respecting the limits of what the evidence can truly support. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson left behind. The disaster was not the result of one catastrophic mistake waiting to be discovered. It was the consequence of multiple reasonable assumptions failing together at the worst possible moment. When viewed through that lens, the empty seats in the earliest lifeboats are no longer the central mystery. They become a symbol of something much larger, reminding us that the greatest tragedies often emerge not from a single failure, but from many small decisions, unseen limitations, and lost opportunities that only become fully visible after history has already rendered its final verdict.